welcome to Pay It Forward, and I did promise you all a gorgeous new Sherpa project, and of course I said that I would make an Easter cuddle bunny for us all. And here she is, and she's big and she's gorgeous and she's squashy. She is designed after a lop-eared bunny, so gorgeous long ears, very thick face and thick features, perfect for cuddling. So I hope you've got your Sherpa ready. You can make this one in a couple of other fabrics which we'll talk about, but for now you just need that free pattern, and that is in the description box below. You just need to print out your free pattern templates from that link, and make sure that you set your printer to be printing at actual size, or perhaps A4, or even try letter. I know it's complicated sometimes with printers, but look, you can always chat to myself or Mr. T in the comments and we will help you with that printing, but usually you have no problems. There is a measuring bar guide on each of those pattern template pages for you, so do utilize that to make sure that your pattern pieces are absolutely correct. And remember that I always include all seam allowances within my patterns for you. So let's make a beautiful cuddle bunny together. So let's have a look at what we're going to need to make our beautiful cuddle bunny. Now, as this is part of my Sherpa collection, of course I'm going to be making mine in Sherpa Fabric. Now, I do have a video that I've made recently. It's a review about Sherpa and the different types, and also a review on synthetic knit back fabrics that you could use. I'm not a fan of synthetic fabrics in the furs, but I do love this Sherpa. But I do give you lots of hints and tips in that video to show you how to treat the backing fabrics of those fabrics to make them really workable. I do find this brand of Sherpa to be really lovely to work with, but you do need to treat it with a PVA mixture. So in that video that I'm going to put the link up the top there for you, it's going to talk to you about applying a PVA, a simple and inexpensive PVA treatment to the back of some of your pattern pieces. That's what makes it workable. And we do need some structure with this one to keep that beautiful head design and just to make it easier for you to sew with. So do check that out, and then you'll understand what I'm talking about these different PVA points. So I am obviously going for this gorgeous pink. I've been dying to use it. I'm going to pair it with a little bit of off-white in a couple of areas. So let's start with the body pieces. We've got the body back pieces, which I have cut. Now on the body back pieces, the areas I have treated with that PVA mixture are of course the openings, that stops them fraying, and just the points and the necklines. It just makes it easier to cut out and manage. Likewise, on the front body pieces, I've done the neck and the base here. So those are front body pieces. Now, another alternative for this pattern is you could actually piece the front belly section, the off-white that I'm using in the face and the paw pads. You could have a full white belly, or of course a different coloured belly. That's entirely up to you. I will say this pattern will make up beautifully also in mohair. So we've got our body pieces all set there, and then we need our leg pieces. So our leg pieces are cut on a doubled over fold, so that we fold it over and we've only got one seam to sew. And of course I'm adding those foot pads in there. Now the foot pads, I treat the complete foot pad with that PVA mixture. It makes it nice and firm and stable, stops it stretching. Again on my openings, and also the lower section of those feet there, makes sewing that foot pad in so much easier. So I've got one of the legs made already, and you can see the beautiful contrast of that cream against that gorgeous fuchsia. It works really, really well. So then we have our arms. Now the arms, I haven't added paw pads. I'm keeping this all really, really simple. You've got your inner arm and your outer arm. Again, treating with PVA those openings there, and perhaps just the tips of the hands, just makes them easier to put together and sew. Again, we've got that little arm already made up there, and you can see they come up absolutely beautiful. So those are our body and limb pieces. And then we've got our beautiful long floppy ears. So this is one of them all made up, and you can see I've just lined it with the cream. So when it sits against the bunny's head, we get that nice splash of cream there. Now on these pieces, we want them to be really soft and floppy. So I only add that PVA mixture just at the top here, because that's where we're going to be inserting it into our seam of our head. You can add a tiny little bit on the base. It helps you tuck those fibres in. So those are those beautiful ears. Let's move on to the head. So with the head, we've got our side head pieces, and we have a contrasting muzzle section. Now with the head pieces, everything to do with the head, I fully coat those pieces in the PVA mixture so that we keep that beautiful head shape and design. And the same, of course, with that centre head gusset. There's just enough contrast on here that's really going to show up that real bunny shape. So they are fully treated with that PVA treatment. And then we have that little cotton tail. Now, they are cut with two different pieces because it's nice to have the same body colour up against the body and that nice little pop of that contrasting fabric. So with the tail, it's very easily stitched into place, but you're going to see that I'm actually going to joint mine in place. You don't have to do that. But if you want to joint the tail, let's now have a look at the joints we're going to use. If you do want to joint the tail, I'm just using a 25mm joint. That's all in your materials and requirements, but remember that that is optional. So I'm using my jointing system. If you are not familiar with my jointing system, I will also put a link at the top there. Have a good look at that. I will say this much. A lot of people say to me, oh, you know, I'm hoping to make something that doesn't have any joints. Making an animal or a bear or anything like that, which is completely unjointed, which is all sewn, is one of the hardest things you'll ever do. You just don't realise how easy it is to make the limbs separately and join them together. This is just a really simple bit of hardware and it will make the difference. I encourage you all to try them. They're nothing to be nervous about. They're simple. They make the whole procedure easier. And I will give you a fully unjointed bear probably at some point, but you'll find if you are a beginner sewer or even an intermediate, it's much harder to get everything balanced and right. You really have to be quite precision in your sewing. So that's why I go for joints, and I just find the overall look of the animal holds itself better and sits better. So you need your neck joint, which is a 40mm, two leg joints, which are 40mm. You need your two arm joints, which are 35mm, and of course that optional tail joint if you wish. Now I'm going to be using premium teddy bear eyes, glass eyes. I'm using 14mm here. It's a good size for this project. I'm using a light smoked topaz colour that's going to work well with my pink. I'm not putting anything behind them. I'm going to use them exactly as they are because I'm keeping this all very simple. You may wish to use safety eyes. If you're making this for a much younger child, you can use safety eyes in this project. I will show you how to pull that head, the eye sockets in to give you some more dimension. If you're adding eyes like this, it's much easier to get that pull in of those eyes, but I will show you a couple of tips of how to do that with your safety eyes. But I do think 14mm is the right size. So also you will need your extra strong threads. We're going to be filling with polyester filling. We're going to be sewing in a simple nose and mouth in just with a pearl thread. I've got 8-ply here and I'm going for the brown rather than a black, not quite so harsh. And so that's about it. We are ready to start. So we're going to start with our body pieces. And the first thing we're going to do is sew. We've got our center front seam of our tummy here, and we're going to line up the top. I've got my pins here ready. Now, working with Sherpa or any kind of pile, you need to tuck that pile in. Now, Sherpa's quite firm in that it's tricky to get that pile tucked in, but I'll just show you. I've got that first one in because you want to make sure that top neckline is lined up. If you just get your finger and encourage it in and pull your edges over, you'll find it quite happily tucks in there by itself. I just encourage those a little and give it a pin, and I just continue that, make my way down. I really want all of that pile to be tucked in the seam. If you just sew it with all the pile poking out, you end up with very flat, unusual looking seams, and you want your seams to be quite flawless like this. So this, when you sew it up by tucking the pile in, that's the finish that you get. That's what we're after. So all you need to do is pin that one all the way down around that belly to the base here. Your seam allowance in this project I've increased to about 5 millimeters. Try not to go deeper than that. And you'll find that's a whole lot easier if you do what I do. And I overcast, hand stitch every single seam throughout this bunny. That's just what I do when I work with Sherpa. It's what I do when I work with nearly everything. But it just makes all the difference. You remove those pins, and then when you go to tuck this one under the machine, those edges are already nicely bound, so you can easily keep to a 5 millimeter seam allowance. Throughout, I will sew most of these body parts. I will sew these seams 2 times for strength because we're adding filling. So we're going to do that front center seam. Then we're going to take our back section. So this is our center back seam, which has our opening. We're going to do the same thing, tucking in that fur. This is our neck, and we're going to stitch down just to the start of that opening. And whenever you've got an opening, you make sure you really back and forth on the start and finish, because that's where we're going to be adding everything. Our joints, we're going to be opening that up to fill it, so it needs to be strong. We leave that section open, we continue on, and we're going to stitch all the way down to the base there. So again, I will sew that one with a 5 millimeters seam allowance, sew it 2 times. I'm using a jeans needle in my machine, as I always do. It can cope with all those layers. And I have, when I sew with Sherpa, I have my machine stitch length set to 2.5, just because it does move along and feed better through the machine. I normally sew at a stitch length of 2 with most things, but the Sherpa, because it's thick, works better with a 2.5. So see how you go with that. So we're going to get the back seam and that front seam stitched up first. So you can go ahead and turn those pieces through once you've got them stitched. And the thing with Sherpa, with getting the fur, any pile that might be trapped within the seams, you have to be very gentle with it because of the nature of the fabric. It can turn to fuzz very easily. If you do have anything particularly trapped, just go through and very gently lift it out on that seam line if you've got any areas where you can see it needs to come out. But certainly don't use any kind of a brush or anything like that. You see how I'm just lifting that pile out, and you'll get that lovely finish. I often find that all that's necessary is just to go over it with your fingernails and brush that pile up. So there's our front and our back section stitched. So now we're going to add the front to the back. So the way that we do that is we take our center seams, we're going to match those up. So our center base seams there, I've taken a couple of those overcasting stitches out so that I can open that seam nice and flat on both of those pieces. You can do a tiny little bit of trimming here if you like, if that helps you tuck that all in. But we're going to take a pin and take it straight through at the seam allowance, straight through, and line up both those center seams. Make sure that it's right in the center. And then we're just going to tuck that pile again and we're going to make our way up each side. I tend to go from side to side so that I'm keeping it all nice and even. And we're going to match that up all the way up to that top neck edge, and you'll see that it will fit perfectly. And we're going to do the same on the other side. So we've got that all pinned into place all the way around. Then we're going to go ahead, I'm going to go ahead and overcast that in place. Then I will stitch that seam right the way around as I did before 2 times, making sure to stop and start to reinforce our start and finish. Now before we turn this one through, once you've got that all sewn up, I go ahead and sew a running stitch with a doubled strand of my extra strong thread around that top neck edge, and I start at the back, leave the tail ends hanging, and then draw that in and tie it off about 4 times, leaving just enough room for your center neck bolt to pass through. That's where we're going to join the head. And also I go ahead and I add my holes at the marks that we have on our pattern pieces, ready to add our arms and legs. You can see that there. And I'm also going to add the hole for the tail because I'm jointing the tail. So I just use my awl to go through. And you notice I'm going just one side of the seam, not straight through the seam, just to preserve the integrity of that seam. So now we can just turn that one through and we will be able to push all those seams out. And then we will just make sure that everything is nicely brushed out on those seams with perhaps with our awl or just with your fingers, so that it's all ready to go. See, there's just enough space there. Push all of those seams out really, really well and roll them out. And as I said before, you can go through those and pull out any caught fibres out of those seams. So we're going to pop that one aside, that body is done, and we can move on to making the arms. So I've of course got one already made here. So you have an inner arm and an outer arm. And the inner arm has your joint spot. And so we put those together, right sides together. And when you're making your arms, all of the work that you do, you need to do the work on the outer arm. The reason for that is it's going to follow, that arm's going to follow the curve that you naturally create when you're working on it with pinning and sewing. So we work with that and make it work in our favour by sewing both of them, pinning, sewing and machining all of that arm work on the outer arm, and it helps it have a nice natural little curve inwards, so into the bear's tummy rather than splaying out. In is always a better look with a stuffed animal. So it's just about remembering to do that on both of those arm pieces. So we're just going to, first of all, going to line up those 2 marks there, which are there for our opening. And of course on this one, our PVA mixture is on that opening, so it won't fray away. And I've got a little at the base here. So I'm just going to pin that one all the way around, leaving that opening. I'm going to overcast it as always. And then I'm going to stitch all the way around 2 times with that same 5mm seam allowance, and make sure that you go back and forth on your start and finish so it's nice and strong. Before you turn that one through, do make sure that you go ahead and make that hole through your joint spot. Then you can get it turned through. And if you're using my method of jointing, which is my nut and bolt method, you'll need to get some clear craft glue, and of course that bolt is glued to that disc, and you can see there that I have glued up the inside there. It's just a fabric glue, and we're going to take that and we're going to glue it in at our joint spot there. Tuck that in with my forceps, bring that bolt through that loop, through that hole there, and really make sure all those fibres are pressed down. Now the reason why we glue them in is so that when we go to do up that connection on the other side, that it won't spin. We'll be able to tighten it properly. And a good way to squash that all down is to add the other side for now, and we can tighten up that nut just temporarily. It just holds everything in place, and it means that you can go ahead and fill those arms with our polyester filling, which we will do now. Now it is a cuddle style animal, so we don't have to pack super firm, but I always like everything to be quite firm. But I certainly like the hands to be really nice and firm because they will hold their shape over the years. Hopefully a child's little hand will be hanging on to this one and dragging it all over the place. So if you've got those packed nice and firm, it will hold its shape better for longer. So you can see I'm just taking my polyester filling and then I'm really packing it in there. And I'm going to do the same with the top of the shoulder, and I don't want that filling to be slipping down. The midsection of that arm, I'm going to be a little softer with the filling so that they sit nicely. You'll also notice that I'm still filling with holding the outer arm facing downwards. So I'm still encouraging with my filling for those arms to be curved in that way. Sounds like a very, you know, perfectionist thing, but it really does make all the difference to your finished animal being all nicely balanced. So I will really pack that in on that shoulder, then I'll go ahead with my wool felting needle and just really tuck those fibres in. That's going to stop them from slipping. One of the other good things about working with Sherpa is the inside, the backing fabric, grabs stuffing very well. So it tends to stay in place, which is another bonus. So I'll have a very firm hand, very firm shoulder, and then just a little bit softer through the midsection there, a little bit of give. So I'm going to get that packed in. And once I've got it packed up right to that opening, I will tuck those fibres in, then we'll come back and we'll close that opening. So I have that one nicely filled, and I have gone ahead and used my felting needle to tuck all of those fibres in and keep them out of the way. And you can also see that I've just gone ahead and just trimmed from the edge just a little way in, remove some of the bulk of that fur, and it's only about 2 millimeters. Don't do more than that or it will show, but it does help you pop those stitches in. We're going to be closing this opening with a ladder stitch. Now a ladder stitch is a fully linked stitch that we use for all of our closing all of our openings. I do have a video that shows you how to sew the ladder stitch. Probably will be clearer on a felt limb, which I show you in that video. I'll put the link up the top there so you can have a look at that one if you haven't sewn this stitch before. But I'm going to show you the basic procedure here. So I have my extra strong thread. I've got a single strand and I've got a big pile of knots in the end. Now you'll notice I'm using quite a dark thread there. It's kind of a deep plummy colour. It really will be quite hidden with all of these, within all of these fibres. So what I find is that when you're working with Sherpa and you're closing an opening, try and use a thread that is more visible for you because it gets quite hidden in there. So we're going to start, we're coming up on this side of our seam. We're going to come out at the seam allowance right where that seam starts to open out. So where our machine stitching finished, and we're going to go straight in that side, and that is going to hold with that knot. Just get those fibres out the way, and then we're going to travel straight across to the other side, and we're going to dive in the other side of that seam, the same seam allowance, and we're just going to travel down the length of one stitch, which is around about 3 to 4 millimeters. You can make your stitches a little larger with Sherpa. So I've pulled that nice and tight, and that's pulled that top section of that seam together. Now we're going to travel back across to where we started, and actually going to put my needle into that very first entry hole. And do the same thing and travel down the length of one stitch. You can see there, pull that in. Now with the Sherpa, because it's quite an open weave, we can do a couple of stitches before we pull it all up. So I've travelled back again to the other side. I'm going to go down the length of a stitch, back the other side in that same exit hole. So you see how it's all fully linked. Again, just travel down the length of one stitch. And now I'm going to put my needle in there, push that seam up, give it a squeeze, and you can see that's knitted that perfectly together. In fact, I actually have to pull it open to see where my last stitch went in. So that's a really good thing. So you can see that you really do need a visible thread to be able to do that. Unless your eyes are a whole lot better than my poor old eyes these days. So I've travelled across there. You can see I'm going to do the same thing and come back again, travel down just that little bit, and make my way down, squeezing that in, pulling on that thread all the way down. Do check out that video, it will show you exactly how to go about doing it, but it really is that simple, and I'm going to continue on till that opening is closed. And there you can see all done, a nice invisible closing there. So we've got our two arms done now, and we're going to move ahead and make these legs. So that's my leg. Now of course you don't have to use Sherpa in the foot, you can use felt or some other fabric. I just want this one to be very, very simple. I love the cream Sherpa with the fuchsia pink, so I'm going with that very soft look. So we just get our leg section and we just fold it over right sides together there to match up from toe right up till the top here. We've got our opening in the middle. In the same way that we worked on the outer side, on the outer arm, we're going to do the same with the leg. So this is our inner leg because that's where our joint spot is. So all of my work, all of my pinning and my tacking and my machine sewing is going to be done on the outer leg. And so long as you repeat that with the other leg, you'll find that they'll be way more balanced, and when your bunny's put together, those legs will turn out just the same either side. There won't be one going this way and one going the other way. So I'm going to do the same thing as I did with the arms, where I'm going to pin to this bottom of this opening and round to the top there. I'm going to overcast and then stitch on the machine down to the toe. This section's left open for us to add our foot pad. So I sew that one 2 times with that same 5mm seam allowance. Our next step is to add our foot pad. Now that we've got that limb all stitched, what I am going to do is I'm just going to take out a couple of those tacking stitches at the front there so that I can open that seam out nice and flat. Just remove those stitches, open up that seam and press it flat, because we're going to be taking our pin, our foot pad, the wide part is at the toe, and we're going to take our pin through that 5mm seam allowance and straight through the centre of that seam, also at the seam allowance. You want to make sure it is going straight through the centre. And that's our first anchoring point. And then we do the same at the back, through that mark, and then again through that centre mark at the back. And I take my pin and I go through again and push that pin head all the way down. So now we're going to pin in the rest, and I work from side to side. This foot pad fits perfectly if you've followed your 5mm seam allowance. I take my pin all the way through, flip it over and take up just a little bit on the other side of the foot and push that pin head all the way down. That really clamps those edges together, and it means that we're pinning it in 3D, so it's going to hold itself really well. So my pin through all the layers, flip it over, take up a little bit on the other side, pin head all the way down. And I'm just going to make my way. You can see already that that foot pad is going to fit in beautifully. I'm going to get it all pinned into place, and then I'm going to overcast it with my tacking stitch. Then we're going to come back and I'm going to show you that stab back stitch that we used to sew partially some of this in. Here you can see that foot pad is just overcast in place there. Now the reason why that foot pad went in so easily is of course because I had that PVA mixture painted on the back of the sole and also the lower edge of that whole foot. So it does make all the difference because it's nice and firm and it holds itself. Otherwise that fabric is very soft and it's like trying to sew jelly together. So what I'm going to do here now is I'm going to hand sew just the top curve and the lower curve into place, and I'm going to match up the sides there on the machine because it's easy to get that in the machine. I want those top and bottom curves to be absolutely perfect, which is why I hand sew them in. You can hand sew in the whole foot pad, which often I do, but here these are quite big, so I'll be able to get them under the machine. So I'm going to be sewing a stab back stitch. This is a single strand of extra strong thread. I have got I will put one in now, a knot in the end of a single strand. And I'm going to come up from the underneath there, remove my tangles, and that knot will hold. So again, I'm using that deep sort of a plummy tone. When you're sewing in a foot pad, you always match your thread colour to the leg, the main body. You don't match it to the foot pad colour. It will be more invisible if you match it to the colour of the leg. So I'm just going to do 2 stitches here right on top of each other. Also again, the benefit of using a slightly darker thread is that we can see it. When you're in doubt, when you're sewing in a foot pad or closing openings about a thread colour, always go darker rather than lighter. It will always be more invisible. So I'm just coming up from the underneath. Now there is a video for this stitch up on my video list. I'll put the link up the top there for you. And it is the stitch we use to sew anything by hand in soft sculpture. It's very strong and it's fully linked. So I've come up, I've travelled the length of a stitch on the underside and I've come up. I'm going to go back in to that first stitch. And then I'm going to travel along. Each time it's probably just about 2.5 to 3 millimeters. Each time I'm going back into the exit hole that I just came out of, pulling those stitches nice and taut, keeping to my seam allowance, and each time back in. So your needle's going all the way through and then all the way back in again. It's why it's called a stab back stitch. It's not a regular back stitch, there's a huge difference. So this one keeps everything in place and it stops everything slipping or moving. So now I'm just going to continue with that one around to here. I'm going to do the lower curve and then join it up on the machine. Now when you're sewing a stab back stitch, because it's fully linked and it's extra strong thread, you only need to sew that one time. When I sew the machine stitching part, I will sew them 2 times. I've turned that leg through now. You see that beautifully stitched in foot pad, and before I've done that I've also gone ahead and added that joint hole as I did before. So now we're going to do the same thing as we did with the arm, where I have that glued up disc the right size leg disc, which is your 40mm leg disc, and that's going to tuck in there and come up through that hole as before. Again, making sure it's centered. We've pushed all those fibers down, and I'm going to add the other side to it just for now, just to create a clamp situation that will let me continue on with the work on that leg. And now I'm going to go ahead and fill with my polyester filling. I'm going to fill that foot and ankle really nice and firm. The top of the thigh around that joint nice and firm. Again, I'm going to take my wool felting needle and pack that in until I've got a result like this. So you can see there's not much give there at all, and it's a very, very firm foot. Through this section, not quite as firm, and then we will go ahead, and you just need to do exactly as we did with that arm and trim that seam there and close that opening in the same way as we did the arm. Okay, so that has those two legs completed and all stitched up, and now we can move on to our little cotton tail. So regardless of how you're attaching this tail, it's sewn up in the same way. You can see there that I've put my right sides together again. You've got marks on your pattern pieces that show you to leave an opening, as we have been, and you're just going to stitch right the way around as I have. You can see that I've still overcast that first. If you're attaching it with a joint, you now need to go ahead and make that hole ready for the joint before we turn that one through. Might need a little bit of help with that with a knitting needle. And there is PVA mixture on the opening so that that won't fray away, just as we have done with all of those other openings. And that just gives us just that sweet little tail that will be attached either by a few stitches straight through, or as I'm going to do here with that joint. So just as I did with the arms and legs, I've got that tail joint there ready, and I'm just going to slip it in, and it's glued up. Slip that in that opening and pop it out through that hole. Make sure that's all pressed down well. Again, I'm just going to secure it for now with the other pieces. When you do this, it also stops you losing all your bits and pieces for your joints. So that'll hold that nicely into place. I will go over that tail and just pull out from the seams all of that fur. And then I'm going to go ahead and just add a very small amount of filling in this tail. Doesn't need to have much in there at all. Just to plump it out just a little bit. Just add some nice fullness at the base. I'm going to use my wool felting needle to tuck all of that in. Then I'm just going to go ahead, you can trim a little bit away from that edge again if you like, and just close that opening with that same ladder stitch that we used on the arms and the legs. There we have, little tail complete and ready to add. So we're going to move on to the head now. I'm going to make up my second ear because I'm incorporating the ears into that head seam. Now you don't have to do that. You can actually sew these ears on at the end if you prefer. I like to add them into that head seam because, number one, I just think it's easier, and number two, you get that lovely lift and turn over from the head when you add them into the seam, and that's what I really want. Either way, what we do first is, just as I have in a couple of areas, just trim off at your seam allowance of about 5mm that coat on both sides there. It's going to make it easier for if you need to turn that edge under to stitch yours on to the head afterwards, or for inserting into that head seam, which is the way that I'm going to do it. So we're just going to put right sides together, and I do work on the ears. I work on the side, on the outside of the ear, for the same reason. It just tends to curl that ear around better that way. So working on the outer side of your ear to do all of your pinning and all of your stitching. Now this one we only need to sew once on the machine because we're not adding any filling. I've given you a mark at the base of that ear. It's going to help you line that up and get that all pinned together. But you will find that because we haven't put a lot of PVA mix on this one, it's pretty soft. So tucking that in is just slightly more challenging on this one, but we want that ear to be lovely and floppy. I have, however, put PVA mixture on the top edge there. So I'm going to get that one pinned and overcast, and then I'm going to sew that same 5mm seam allowance and leave this top section here open for turning. And there we have two beautiful ears. Now I've gone and just stitched across those openings once I've turned them through and pushed all those seams out. If you're going to be sewing the ears on afterwards, you'll need to turn those edges under and just slip stitch that opening closed. So we'll pop those ones aside and we can actually start work on the head. So we've got our two side head pieces and we have our two side muzzle pieces just to add that contrast there. And what we're going to do with those is put right sides together. Again, very important here to be tucking this pile in, and we're going to pin those in place. And these pieces have PVA fully coated over the back of them, the whole lot. So we get a nice firm little skull shape and keep that design shape nice and true. You'll find that you've got a slight point extending this end and a slight point extending this end. That's good, that allows for our seam allowance. So get those all pinned into place. Do exactly the same with this one, and we're just going to stitch that 5mm seam allowance again. I will of course overcast mine first and do the same, exactly the same with this one. Next step is to sew our centre front chin seam. So again, we put those right sides together. Extremely important to match up this seam because this is the very front of your bunny's nose. We want everything to line up well. And we're going to do the same thing. Pin, tuck, overcast and stitch from that nose tip down to the neck edge. Make sure you're back and forth on that neck edge there, and at your start there it is that same 5mm seam allowance, and make sure that throughout sewing this head that you're sewing all of your seams twice because we're really going to pack that head nice and firm. Make sure that you turn that front seam through and really push those seams out and just lift out any coat that may be trapped there. And now we're ready to add our centre front gusset. And so what I've done first of all here is I've taken my scissors and I've just trimmed, just on an angle, the very edges of that coat back going into that point. We're going to trim it more once it's put together, but it just makes it easier for popping that one in. So you've got a centre mark, going to take your pin and put it straight through that centre mark at your 5mm seam allowance. Make sure it's dead centre. You'll also notice that I've opened up the overcasting stitching on that front chin seam so that I can put my pin straight through at that seam allowance and come straight through that junction there. push my pin head all the way down and make sure it's really centered. I'm tucking the fur in, and I'm just going to start lining up those two edges and pinning that one into place the same way as we did the foot pads. So through both layers, flip it over, take a bit on the other side, move across to the other side so that we're pinning it in evenly, and do the same thing here. At this stage, we're only going to pin in the front nose section. You can see how that's just going to fold around, tucking in all of that fur. Now you've got a mark on your centre head gusset piece here, and you've got a mark on your side head piece there. Ideally, if you've kept all your seam allowance as well, those two match up beautifully. And we do that, we do match that up so that when we turn that head through, the sides of our muzzle here are even. There's not one sitting more forward. So pin both of those in place, got them nicely accurate both sides. Do the same thing, anchor that in, really tucking that fur in. Always pin heads all the way down to clamp that into place. I will add a couple of more pins there, and then I'm just going to overcast just that front nose section. Now I have that gusset hand stitched in with that overcasting thread. The most important part of sewing this section in is making sure that that center point is absolutely centered with the front of that seam, because this bunny, we don't cover that nose section. We just pop in a couple of stitches to make a nose and a mouth indication, more like a real bunny. So you really want that junction when we turn it through to be absolutely spot on. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to hand sew with our stab back stitch using my extra strong thread, and I'm just going to sew just that section in. So I'm starting right on that mark and coming up from behind, and it's exactly the same stitch as we used on the foot pads. So remember to check out that video, and you can go ahead and stitch in just that nose section. Make sure that you're pulling those stitches nice and tight, because we're compressing quite a few layers there. So I'm just going to make my way all the way around, really anchor in either side that front, and then finish off at the side at that same mark. So you want to make sure that once that's stitched, that you pop that through, and you want to check that you have got everything nice and neat, and that point is very defined at the front there and lined up with your front center seam, and that is. So now, because I'm going to be incorporating my ears into the head, what we're going to do is add our first ear, and we add it to the side of the head on the inside, obviously with right sides together. My right side, of course, the part of the ear that sits against the head for me is the cream side, and you've got a mark on your pattern template that shows you exactly where that ear starts. So the first thing that I will do is line that up and make sure that that section, you see now why we trimmed a little bit away, makes it easier to sit that in there. And I'm going to just hand stitch that temporarily into place. So that ear now is just tacked into place from that mark. That's the start of the ear. Tack it into place to line up with that head, just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about here. So once that head is pushed through, that's the look that we're going to get, those ears. So make sure that that inside ear is facing the side of the head there, and we just do them one at a time because there's a fair bit of bulk to tuck into that head now when we go and sew that center head seam. So what I'm going to do now, of course, all of these pieces do have that PVA mixture on them, and I'm able to just pin those edges together right the way around, and of course that ear is going to be incorporated as we do that. It's just a matter of making sure once you pin that in. So there's a lot of layers there, there's 4 layers there to stitch through, and you want to really make sure that that ear is totally incorporated within that seam. Still tucking the fur as we go. And then take this one all the way down to line up at the base of the neck there. You'll also notice that I'm doing all of the work on the head gusset. Don't be doing this from the side head. All this work, the pinning, the overcasting and the stitching. So this one, you should be able to overcast it and then pop it under the machine and stitch that seam 2 times, same 5mm seam, linking up with your stitching here. And then we will go ahead and repeat the same with the opposite side. And the next ear, of course, will get added here in the same way, in the right spot, tacked into place, and then we will do the same and we will line up the other side. Of course, we'll have 2 ears poking out of this neck, so it gets quite full. You might have to do a little bit of hand stitching when you're sewing this side in. But we'll get those all stitched into place, then we can turn that head through. So just to show you, this is the squeeze that you have with those ears in there when you're adding that second side. So if you'd rather not deal with that, I still pop that under the machine and stitch that round. Not a problem, but I guess it's the lesser of 2 evils. Do you want to sew the ears on at the end, which I hate doing, or battle a little bit here anyway? Totally up to you. But I've got those ears stitched in now, so it's easy for me to turn that one through the right way. And we should just have our perfect little bunny head with ears in place. And you need to check that you have incorporated those ears well into those seams, otherwise pull them back through and re-stitch. But it looks like everything's good here. And we've got that lovely bunny head with ears beautifully in place there. So our next step is to push all those seams out really well. Go over it with your awl or your tool, something suitable. Pull out all of those fur tufts and we will start to fill this head. So when I say pack it firm, I really mean pack it firm. So get in there with your wool felting needle to help you do that. Really fill out the shape of that head, especially this front muzzle section, because we're going to do some nice tight stitching here on that nose and mouth, and we want to do a little bit of mouth trimming. So really fill it full right up until nearly the edge, and I will then come back and we will pop in that neck bolt. So here is my filled bunny head, and now at the moment she looks very, very round. We're going to be doing some sculpting in a little while. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be pulling in these eye sockets here to give more of that realistic bunny shape. We're going to do a little bit of trimming on the nose and in the mouth area here. If you are using safety eyes, you'll need to temporarily stuff that head to get your eye placement, check it, unstuff it, pop the eyes in. So you might want to wait until you see the eye placement. Of course, I'm adding mine at the end, but you will see exactly where they need to go, and also the sculpting that we do across. For now, I have sewn with a doubled strand of extra strong thread, a running stitch all the way around that neck edge, left my tail ends hanging there. I've tied my first knot, and we're going to drop in that neck bolt, which of course has a longer bolt. Remember that with your neck joints. And we're going to drop that in, and this is where you might need somebody to help you to be able to pull this in and hold that knot. But you want to draw those edges in together as tight and as close to that bolt as you possibly can. So I'm probably going to get Mr. T to put his thumb on there, and I will knot that off at least 4 times. So our next step is to look at eye placement. Now you must remember that bunnies' eyes sit at the side of their head. They're not really visible from the front. So we want to stay in keeping with that. So I've just used my eye tester pins and just pop those in there. So we get an idea. They're going to be pulled right in. And you do want to pull them in while you're checking them to get a good idea of how they're going to look. So have a look at the side, from across the top of the head, from the underneath, and make sure that you're getting them even. You can see whether they sit about an inch from that point there where your other colour starts. So once you've got that eye placement where you want it, you need to come in with your scissors. First of all, make those holes larger with your awl and your knitting needle. They can be quite large, and I've marked it with a marker pen as well so I can see exactly where I'm going. And we're going to trim just about the size of the eye that you're using. So mine's a 14mm eye, and I'm going to trim more, but for now I just want to have enough space around that eye so that I can see what I'm doing. So now we're going to do some sculpting. We're going to get this sculpted in. So if you're using safety eyes, you can pop the eyes in because you have to do them that way. Pop them in, stuff the head, and then you can do this afterwards, but you won't be able to do it exactly in the eye socket like I'm doing. You'll have to do it just behind or just in front. You'll see what I mean. Big long dowel needle and a double strand of extra strong thread with a big knot in the end. I'm going in the first eye socket, I'm coming out the other one. Straight out through there. I don't want to catch any of the fabric itself. I just want to compact the stuffing in here. So pull that one nice and tight, and I'm going to go back through and come out again. So you need a fairly long thread, and we're going to start squeezing and pulling. My knot didn't hold, so we're going to perhaps start on the underneath here and travel up this way. Might be better. So that knot will hold on the base there. Go back in again. Travel across and come out. When you're using a needle this big, doesn't matter how big the knot is, it follows through with the size of that needle. So there we go, we'll do it that way. Pulling in, that's got a nice firm hold now, like I said. So now we'll go across through that other eye socket. Give that a nice squeeze. This section here we're squeezing in. So when we do this, we're squeezing in this front of the muzzle, but we're also giving some nice little cheeks behind and underneath. So back through, always coming out that same hole, and always giving it a squeeze. And back again. Coming out exactly on that same eye socket each time. So it's the stuffing underneath that I'm pulling in. So you can see I'm really pulling it in. You don't need to worry about it popping or anything like that, because this extra strong thread is just so strong. And we're creating that nice little domed section on the top there that bunnies naturally have. So I'm going to keep passing through there, probably up to about 6 to 8 times, till I'm absolutely certain that that's going to hold. When I'm happy with that, I'm going to dive in one of the eye sockets and I'm going to come out at the base of the neck and knot that off to hold down there. So that has my sculpting done, and I really hope you can see the difference there. The shaping of that has pulled in this section here and created lovely cheeks here at the side and a nice dome to the top of the head. So it's definitely worth doing. Now, if you're using glass eyes, if you try to get that amount of pull in just by pulling the eyes in, you'll probably snap the eyes. So that's why you need to let that extra strong thread do that work for you, and you'll find that will last forever. That, unless you got in there and snipped those threads, because I've gone through 8 times doubled, it's never going to break. So now we can just pop those eyes in as we would normally, and as I said, I'm not doing anything special here with these eyes. I really did promise to keep this series simple, so I am doing that. Remember, if you have added those eyes as safety eyes and filled your head, you'll find that that head will still have that big round look. So you can come in just behind those safety eyes and pass your needle through to give that pull in, or perhaps just in front. So now I'm going to add the eyes. So I'm actually using dental tape. I've used dental tape for years to put my eyes in. For a little while I've been using extra strong thread. A lot of people say that the dental floss breaks down and so that it's not reliable and so on. I've been doing this for 30 years, and the animals and creations I made 30 years ago, the eyes are just as strong as they were then. So for me, it's a great choice. I find that dental tape, it grips and it slips, so it's a better option for me. But you make your own decision. You can certainly just use your extra strong thread. So I have my doubled dental tape, and I have then doubled it again, and I found the center and fold all of those ends together. I pass them through that shank in that eye, as we always do. Pull that loop through, open it up, easier said than done, and then pull all of those ends through that loop. So now I've got that eye secure on 4 strands. I then thread that onto my doll needle, which I've already done with one here, and we're ready to add that eye. So I'm now just going to go straight into that hole that we've already been sculpting through, and I can go straight in and come out at the back of the head, somewhere in the center, down nice and low. And pull that one all the way through. And settle that eye in place. You can see how beautifully deep set that eye is. It's a very, very sweet look, and you don't have to put any pressure on the eye this way. So now I'm going to thread up the other one and take that through the other side, and I'm going to bring my needle out of the same hole that I came out of with the first eye. You can make that a little larger with your awl, so it's easy for your needle to find it. So now I have both of those eyes in place, pulled through to the back, and I've tied my one preliminary knot, and I will just make sure that they are exactly right, push on those, knot them off nice and tight, and then knot those thread ends at least 3 or 4 times, snip them, and that knot will be lost back into the head. So there we go, that's got those eyes tied in. Now from here, I just like to do a little bit of extra trimming to really reveal those eyes. And I create a little passageway here, just so that from the front we can see just a little bit of that eye. It's just that little bit more sculpting and making sure that eye is nice and visible. And of course, you could do all sorts to these eyes. You could add a piece of white felt underneath them first to give a bit of an eye surround. That's still very child safe. You could shade them. As I said, I'm going to keep it extremely simple here today, but I do want those eyes to be visible. So when I say about trimming a passageway, it's when you're looking at the animal straight ahead, just trim a section into there, just like that, so the eyes are visible. Okay, so next step is just to stitch in that little nose and mouth line. So before we stitch in just a little nose line and a top lip and a mouth line, I've just done a little bit of trimming, and what I've done is I've just trimmed right along that seam line just a little way. Just trimmed away a little bit of the white, and I've also trimmed right back that pink. So this section here of the nose has been trimmed down and into. Also, I found that centre seam and parted that fur and just trimmed just a little away from the very centre so that I can see what I'm doing there. It's where my stitch is going to be placed. I've decided to go with a very deep maroon colour in keeping with my bunny's pink tones, and I've got a knot in the end of a doubled strand of this Perle thread, which is actually a 5-ply this time. I want it to be quite weighty. Where I'm going to bring my needle in is at the underneath here, and I'm aiming to bring my needle out. It's probably about just over 1 centimetre from the base of that nose. You don't want that top lip too long, and you do want that needle to come out exactly on that seam line. So pull that one through, that knot will hold, and then we're going to go straight up. We're going to make sure that those threads aren't twisted. I'm going to dive in right at the base of that nose there, and where we're going to come out with that needle is just a little way up the side of the nose, just enough to create that cute little V. So you can see where I've come out there, and I've made sure those threads aren't twisted as they go into that nose. And now we're going to pull that nice and tight, and we want to create this little nose piece here that's going to come down here. So we're going to go under those nose stitches, those lip stitches, sorry. Underneath them, not catching any fabric. Pulling all your fibres out. And you want to place that stitch as best you can to follow that line as it goes through and underneath there. Again, not having those stitches twist. Now we can do some trimming afterwards, don't worry if you're losing sight of that. So now our next stitch is going to go in to match up on the other side up here. So make sure you line it up exactly, and you're going to dive in, and we're going to come out at the edge of what will be the smile. So you can test that by holding your thread from the base here, and you can get an idea of where you want that smile to end. So diving in at the side to match up here, and coming out at the edge of your first side of your smile. So you can see I've come out the other side, pulled those stitches in nice and tight. I will trim up around that line afterwards. And the next step is to pull up, place that stitch, pull up, and we're going to go underneath again those lip stitches. So we need to get in there, take our needle underneath without catching those threads. And we want to place that stitch, which we can do because that pile is going to help keep it in place. So we can give it a bit of a curve, pulling that up nice and tight, pull down, keep that tension up because that gives a nice little pull in of that mouth and it allows us to do a bit of trimming. pull that in nice and tight down and match it up on the other side, exit down the base of the neck again and knot off. Now what I've done now is just a little bit of trimming just along those mouth lines. If you just take the coat away, you'll be able to create a little mouth line that gives you some nice little cheeks there. But don't take too much off, just following the line of your stitching, and you'll reveal a little bit more of your stitching. It will be quite hidden, but it's that illusion that we're looking for. And we want a nice full little cheeks here. You can just trim them, and if you take a little more off the top here, following that eye line, like I've done here, it exaggerates those nice little cheeks puffing out at the side. The one thing that I am going to do is just add just a tiny little bit of shading in a soft plummy colour just on the underside here of that chin. I've got my colourless blender here. You could do this with artist pastels. This is just my Prisma pens. They're just alcohol markers, and it just creates a nice little shadow there. And even down the centre there, pulling that out just a little, gives it a natural little look. And the very tip of that nose just highlights it just enough. Very, very soft. Less is more, definitely. Remember, it is just a very basic little design. Over detailing is not what we want to do. But it does just give it just a little bit of depth there, which is really lovely, and I'll probably add just a little around the eyes as well. And that has my bunny's head all complete. Now you can do as much or as little as that shading and trimming as you like. You can just leave it all as it was, pulled in, still got a beautiful shape. But if you want to do just a little bit more work, as you can see, just that little bit of trimming, just remember on the eye line, take away the nose section and just trim along that mouth line. And if you can round out that Sherpa, you get that beautiful little chiseled bunny mouth there. Very, very sweet face. So we have all our body parts. Let's put this bunny together. So I'm going to start with the tail, and I'm jointing mine, and I've already got that spot made ready. If you are stitching the tail on, the best way to do it is to take a doubled strand of extra strong thread on your doll needle, and you want to go in at your tail mark, a long thread, come out one side of it, take a nice bite out of a big stitch across the back of that tail there on your body colour section, and then dive back in the other side, and you can get in there and tie that off, knot it off really nice and firm, and that will hold your tail in place. You could do that in two little spots if you want. Otherwise, go ahead and joint your tail in the way that I am here. So just popping that bolt straight through that hole, making sure everything is compressed down, adding that second disc, washer and nut. Now this tail we don't need to move, so we're just going to tighten that up nice and tight. But you do want to make sure first up that it's sitting with the point lined up with that centre back seam. It's just a nice little effect there. So get my spanner in there and tighten that one up nice and tight, and then I will take my super glue and add just a drop into those threads around that nut so that will never come away. That tail is in place, and now we're going to do exactly the same thing with the legs, and we're going to pop that through that hole we've already made. Make sure that you've got your foot pointing forward, you've got the belly here. Again, pushing those fibres all the way around that disc, adding your second disc. your washer and a nut. Now the legs, we do need to be slightly poseable. So at this stage we just finger tighten. We make sure we have nothing's caught up in between those layers of the joint, that everything is nice and smooth. You want to finger tighten that. It needs to be tight enough that we can just move it. Remember, particularly with Sherpa, those joints will loosen over time because everything will compress and flatten. So always do your joints up just a little bit tighter than you want them. You should be able to move them, but it should be difficult to do so. So tighten that up, do the same thing, drop of super glue, and then you just repeat with the other leg, and then your arms put on in exactly the same way at those spots. So there we have arms, legs and tail all joined, and now the all-important head. And it's lovely to have sewn those ears in and know we don't need to do anything more than that. So just pop that one through, turn her upside down, and again add that corresponding disc, washer and nut. I like the head to be a little more poseable, so I don't do my neck joints up quite as tight. Again, you want to pull that through, check you've got nothing caught up between those joints, and tighten as desired, and another drop of super glue in place. Nothing left to do now except to fill her up. So you can fill her nice and soft and squashy. I don't add any weight to these because the intention is that they are a cuddle companion, so they do need to feel nice and soft. But the areas that you need to fill out are up around this neck area and around the joints. The same at the back. You need to support those joints either side. And then you can keep the midsection quite squashy if that's what you want. I always pack everything quite firm. These are just going to be shelf sitters, so they are not going to anyone in particular. I keep them as samples. So I'm going to fill mine out quite firm, but I will watch at the sides. Now, a lot of people have been asking me, why do my bears and animals' arms stick out like this? They poke out like that. It's usually because you're overfilling underneath the arms in the body section. And if you overfill the body, of course, it pushes the arms out. So this section through here, just under the arm, if you keep it nice and soft, your animal will sit with lovely relaxed arms that turn in nicely at the front there, and it's a really good look. So I'm going to get her filled up and filled right up to the back. I'll use my wool felting needle to tuck everything in, then we'll come back and close that seam. So here we are, and I've got that back all filled out, and I've packed it in with my wool felting needle, but I've left enough room. There's enough movement in that midsection to keep those arms sitting down nicely. Such a cute little back view, back bottom with that little tail there. And I've also gone ahead with my very sharp scissors and just taken off the very edge pile around that opening, just as we did with some of the others. So closing is the same as we did on the arms and the legs and everywhere else. So it's just about taking your extra strong thread, single strand, and coming up on the underneath, finding right where that starts. That seam starts to open out, coming in at your seam allowance in the same way. I'll just turn that towards me. Take that needle through with that nice big pile of knots at the end. The Sherpa does like to grab that thread. And then we're going to travel across as we did before to create our first stitch. Straight across into the seam allowance and just travel down. Just the length of one stitch. Pull that one in, and then we go back to where we started, back into that same hole. Again, I'm using that slightly darker thread so it's easier for me to see, and travel down on the opposite side, that same stitch length. I'm making it look very awkward here. It's usually on my lap, so you need to find yourself the best, most comfortable position to be doing this, where your visibility is the best. You can see as I pull that in, it's pulling those edges together, and we're just going to do the same thing and travel back and forth as we did on the arms and legs all the way down. As you go, if you feel like you need a little bit more filling, you can go and add that as you do so. So do have a look at that video though that I gave you before to be able to get a better visual of how to do this stitch. The other thing you can do is replace your needle at this point with a curved needle. It does help when you're sewing the back up sometimes, because the natural curve of the needle helps you tuck in and straight out again. Totally up to you, but I'm just going to make my way down and our bunny will be finished. So here is our completed Cuddle Bunny, a beautiful bunny for Easter. I think that is just the most gorgeous design, and definitely one for snuggling, taking to bed, a child's companion, and bunnies are so popular with kids. So you can see there that I filled that body just nice and soft through the middle, so that those arms sit in beautifully and the whole project looks comfortable. You can see the even turn of both those feet and those arms. That's due to that mirror sewing, so do pay attention to that. Those gorgeous ears the same. So if you were going to sew your ears on, of course that would be your last task, and you just sew them in, and you've still got your mark on your pattern template that will show you where to stitch them. Just a simple ladder stitch will add them for you. So you can see I've added just a gorgeous little pendant. Now there's a lot going on around here because of those lovely ears, and we don't want to interfere with them. So generally something that hangs down the middle, if you want to add anything at all, is really nice. And this is a lovely resin button pendant that I make. And I have promised I will show you how to make those. I promise I'm going to get those supplies in and give you a quick tutorial on that, because they do look so good with all of the homemade projects. You could alternatively go ahead and create something like this one, would have looked just as good. That's a bag charm that I've got in my video list, and that would look really sweet too. If you keep the focus here, you won't interfere with those ears. So if you have enjoyed making this one, of course we've got the beautiful blue Snuggle Bear. What, don't they look great together? Every grandchild should have both of those. And Mr. Sean the sheep, of course, we can't forget him. He's a darling too. So we're starting quite a collection, aren't we? And we are not stopping here. So looking forward to all of your beautiful colours, and I thank you so much for joining me. Well, thank you all for being with me today and watching this little one come together. If you have enjoyed this video, you could give me a thumbs up. That would be absolutely beaut. And I did mean to say this one would make up really well in a nice thick polar fleece. So, and polar fleece comes in so many colours too. So long as it's nice and heavyweight, it will come up really well, because she's got such lovely thick chunky features. I'm going to be interested to see all of the different fabrics that everybody uses. So long as she's made with love and she's received with love, it's just a successful project, isn't it? So thank you all this week too. We've had a lot of people contacting us, seeing if we're okay. There has been major flooding here, and our little town was hit one of the worst. So basically Mr. T and I ended up on a little island on top of the hill. We live in a very high spot. Fortunately, we were stuck on this little island with our poor town drowning around us. But we were perfectly safe and had supplies. So very sad to see so much loss and damage to our little town, but we are very safe. And I just spent the time putting this little one together. Not even a natural disaster will stop me creating. I'm sure you're all the same. So look, everybody, keep on being safe yourselves, because tomorrow isn't promised, is it? So keep on creating if you can. And if you can't, or you're not feeling inspired, come and join our Facebook group, where we all get together and we all share our projects. all of our Lisa Pay creations, and it's really exciting and uplifting. So we might just recharge your batteries if you're feeling a little low. So come and join us. I'll put that link down below. And of course, I just launched my beautiful Pinocchio art doll in masterclass. If you want to step up with your skills, you can come and join me there. It's going to be a fabulous month over there in masterclass. So I'll put that link below too. And of course, you can always chat to me. If you want to chat to me one-on-one, you're most welcome to come and follow me on Instagram. That link is across the bottom of your screen there. You can chat to me about anything at all. I'm an open book and I'm here to help. So everybody stay safe, keep on being creative, and until next time, make sure you pay all of those good things forward. And it is hooroo from me.